down there that we're not quite sure about. The Aldi mill has not even begun. They built that between 1807 and 1809. Our house is not even there. But if you look over here, you can see right about where what we're calling the dry goods store or the Aldi Tavern, there is a structure. And if you look right adjacent to it, there's also another smaller structure. There's a small square right next to it. So there's already two existing structures in 1807. And whether those are things that Mercer had built because he owned all this land, to basically, if I build it, people will come. How do you build a massive structure like the Aldi mill in the middle of nowhere without having places for these skilled laborers to actually live? So this may have been a dwelling house for people that he was bringing in to help build his vision. So we'll start off first with the 1890s Victorian. It's classic, sort of late Victorian, has sort of subdued designs on it, but in general it's an amazingly well-preserved house. It was aluminum sided at one point. The additions off the back are probably early 20th century, but it's a typical four-square Victorian. And if you look at this 1955 map, you can see some of the historic structures, which unfortunately are no longer here, but some of these may have been the original blacksmith shop that Wynn just mentioned. We have a building down here that I think was a tavern, is that right, Wynn?
Yes.
Yeah, and the adjacent building, we're still not quite sure what that was, but it's obviously a sizable structure, and that's long gone as well. So the current firehouse is right about here on this map. And looking at some of the historical details of the structure, all the original leaded glass is still in there. I love little clues like this. You can see that behind the aluminum siding is the original clapboard siding. You can see just peeking through the top of this window in the attic. And if you look at what John Gulick did to the Aldi Country Store in that adjacent house, I remember driving by it one day after they'd taken off that siding, and it was like a completely new building. It was absolutely charming. So it's amazing what getting back to an original siding can do for the appearance of a house. If you look inside, all the original architectural details are there as well. Fireplace mantles, the original wooden flooring, little details like this around the stairwell, original door hardware, typical late 19th century cast iron surface locks. And we'll skip over to what we're calling the dry goods store. And again, we're not quite sure when this is built. The stone foundation of this may be one of those structures that shows up in that very first map from 1807. We're not quite certain. But in 1813, Mercer sells this plot of land with the land where the Victorian house is on to Aaron Marsteller, that as Wynn just mentioned. And the first mention of a real structure on this property is in 1820, when the tax record indicates it's a building worth $350. In 1830, it passes on to John Ish from Marsteller's widow, and then in 1846 to Lafayette Swart. And then in 1857, it's sold off as a separate small lot, and that's basically what you see today is this small, long, narrow lot that sort of cuts up towards the back of the mountain. And that, from sometime in the 1850s, James Oden had partnered up with Hutchinson and another fellow, and they were running this as a store. I think it was a shoe retail as well. But basically, Hutchinson bought the property at a foreclosure and continued running it as a dry goods store, passing it on to his nephew Clarence Thomas, who continued to run it as a store, who then passed it on to his wife, who passed it on to her sisters. Basically, the same family ran this as a little dry goods store for about 73 years, which is amazing. And then architecturally, you can tell that this is not an early 19th century structure. It was probably updated, I'm guessing, in the 1930s, and that's when it was sold to Mr. Howell. And if you look on the inside, it has a lot of sort of typical features from that time period. It's great that the front double doors are still intact from when it was used as a store. But this beadboard paneling on the inside is sort of indicative of that period. And whether all of this is done over an original structure from the early 19th century, we're not sure, or whether they just tore it down to the stone structure and rebuilt all new is not quite determined yet. So moving on to the main star of the show tonight, which is the Aldi Tavern. Just to review a little bit, talking about Mercer selling it on to Abraham Fulton, and that deed is missing, so we're not quite sure when that transaction happened, but we know that Mr. Fulton had one slave, and whether this I'll mention this later on. There's mention of a log house, and I'm wondering if that may actually be a log house that's on the site. In 1824, he's badly in debt, and that's when it's first mentioned in the deed records as a brick house. So at some point, Mr. Fulton started building this brick house. John Ish, so in 1830, he also acquires a 1-acre lot with a log house on it as well. And so when you look at the aerial map, there's a large area next to this the tavern, which is currently a parking lot, and that may have been the open space where this large log structure was placed. John Ish also had 8 slaves, and he's the one that ran it as a tavern. He applied for a liquor license, and later on it's referred to as a tavern. So this is just my own interpretation of looking at the architecture of the building and the interior features, and this is just my own sort of personal take on how this house evolved over time. So I'm guessing at some time soon after 1810, Mr. Fulton started building the core of the house, and this is a very typical architectural feature you see not only in our house, but great late 19th century house with the copper roof that's just east of here, where you start off with a much more modest structure, and then you have plans to add on to it as time goes on. But inside of the house, there's a very large masonry wall that goes from the basement all the way up to the attic, and so that probably represents this, what we're calling the west wing, or the east wing, sorry. When it was passed on to Mr. Luckett, I'm guessing that they probably added on this small addition to the west, and then a much larger addition was probably added by Mr. Ish after 1831. And one of the most fascinating things for me is, you wonder how did people run this as a tavern and still live in it, having people come in off the street. It's right down on Route 50. And so if you look at the front door, which is elevated, I guess that's where the family would come in, and they kept their living quarters completely separate from the basement. And if you look at right here, you can see there's a crack line, a very definitive crack line in the base. That was a basement entrance that went straight into the basement. So this has all been filled in over time. If you're in the basement, you look out towards that area, you can clearly see in the foundation that this has been basically walled in at some later date. So it's neat to see that the tavern would have operated right out of the basement. The ceiling boards are all whitewashed. There's a huge hearth and fireplace down there, and so it makes sense that that's probably where it was serving up food and spirits for locals. If you look on the inside as well, this is one of the bedrooms. You can see where this western addition was mounted down. The floorboards are completely separated, and that line also transfers to the baseboard molding. Another feature that I thought was unique was the fact that the windows are so deep. I mean, this is usually seen in stone structures where the walls have to be that thick. So because it's all stuccoed on the outside, we really don't know, at least I don't know, somebody else may know, whether the original eastern wing was actually built out of stone, and they built the later additions in brick, and that's probably why they justified applying stucco, was to bring more of a harmonious appearance to the outside. This is the east bedroom, and these are some of the details that really get me excited, because I'm a historic preservationist. I work in a museum. I love things that have not been messed up by people over time, well-intentioned people. But all of the original built-in cabinets, the original doors, the hardware, the little button knobs, I mean, these things are usually lost over time. Later on in the Victorian period, it was much more fashionable to take out these doors, and rather than locking up all of your goods, it was more fashionable to display your stuff, display your china, your silver, and show off your wares. So the fact that all these things are still intact is pretty remarkable. This is the original parlor, and again, original built-in cabinets, these little button knobs. I mean, all of this stuff is completely unmolested. The original flooring, this beautiful white random width hard pine flooring is intact throughout the entire house. And when you get to the basement, things get a little more ugly. But it is remarkable that these are the original floor joists for the first floor. They're hand-hewn tree trunks, just like in our house. Our house had the exact same construction techniques, and both of these structures are contemporaneous. And they would basically bring in a log, just use an adze and dress up the top surface and start laying floorboards on it. So over time, powder post beetles and just wear and tear and rot, the floors began to sag, and so there's some cribbing in there to keep the floors nice and level. In the background here, you can see that huge fireplace hearth that's down in the basement, just this gigantic log of a mantle, which is still intact. Same thing with the roof. You have these hand-hewn logs supporting the roof structure. And we know that the Aldie Mill not only was grinding grain, but they also operated a sawmill. And I think that's one of the details we're trying to determine is when did they get this sawmill up and running? Because it really doesn't make sense to be dragging in tree trunks and hand-hewing logs when you have a sawmill literally a couple hundred feet away from your house. So that may help date the structure as well. Some of the outside buildings, this is a mid-20th century garage. The storehouse, smokehouse, whatever you want to call it, is probably just a storehouse. That's also an early structure, it's probably contemporaneous with the original building. They would have stored all their food items in here and done all sorts of just basic storage for equipment and things, but same thing. The log structure for the floorboards. It does look like, unfortunately, the roof is probably completely replaced at some point, maybe around the time they built this garage. I noticed that the two roof pitches are exactly the same. But the clapboard siding and all that stuff for the roof structure is definitely not original. So in 1848, Mr. Ish, who was running the tavern, was deeply in debt. And so he auctioned off the property, and this is the first time it's referred to as the Tavern House. And he sold it to Nathaniel Odin, and Nathaniel basically gave it to his son James. And the Odins lived down in Glengyle, which is further east of here a couple miles. It's currently being completely surrounded by new development, which is quite tragic. It's an absolutely amazing property. And we're guessing that between 1851 and 54, James Odin added on this huge rear addition off to the south. And amazingly enough, the Odins, their portraits are in the Loudon Museum. I actually just got copies of these this afternoon. So there's Nathaniel. The painting was done of him 2 years after he passed away, but I think portrait painters didn't pass through these areas very often. So his portrait was done posthumously, or whatever that term is. Hulda, she looks like a very stern woman. After Nathaniel passed away, she moved into the Aldi Tavern, and her sons inherited the main property. The Odins were very wealthy. When he passed away, his estate was valued at $72,000, which included 37 slaves. In today's dollars, that's worth $2 million. Let's see, 1860 census, Hulda, she owned 5 slaves, and it's referenced that there was a slave house. And again, going back to that 1830s log structure that's referenced in one of the earlier deeds, I'm wondering if perhaps the slaves were living in that log structure, which was right adjacent to the property. Oh, and I should mention, this is not James, this is his brother, Dr. John Odin, who was a physician, and he died during the Civil War. And he's buried in Newark. 1870, Hulda's living there with her 3 granddaughters. She has 2 African Americans, aged 20 and 8. They're probably serving as servants for the family. In 1880, Hulda's living with 10 people, mostly family, 1 African American servant, and she has 3 boarders. So when her husband passed away, she was allotted an annual allowance of $900, but not expecting her to live so long, I assumed that $900 is starting to become a stretch, and she had to actually take on boarders to make ends meet. These are some architectural details that you can see. There was a porch pilaster that was removed, and so that's the far western wing of the original house. You can see that it is brick underneath the plaster. And then this is underneath the 1850s addition, and it has the original clapboard siding, which is clearly visible in this little electrical box. So here's a rear view looking from the mountain down. At some point, probably in the mid-20th century, they decided to make a very formal, lovely garden out back with terracing. They put in a swimming pool, which is in a poor state of repair. But local lore is that metal detectors have found Civil War items all over this property, all over all 3 of these properties. And so, unfortunately, in the backyard here, because the soil has been disturbed, the provenance of that is altered, but the fact that we know that people were probably camping here after the battle, people were probably being taken care of here and recuperating, just adds to the history. As part of the archaeological survey, where they go around and do these sort of random test pits to look for areas of concentration of artifacts, they found ceramics going back, dating from the late 18th century and all the way up through the 19th century. And jumping up into the 20th century, it had some notable characters that lived in the house. In 1950, Edward and China Loring bought the house, and their son John became a very well-renowned artist and designer. He was the chief designer for Tiffany's for 20 years. Had a great art collection. This is actually one of the paintings that he donated to Yale University in memory of his mother. And then later on, James and Deborah Kaler, I think Wynn knew the Kalers. Ironically enough, he was a founding member of the Aldie Volunteer Fire Department. They're also members of the Ruritan, which I'm a member, and he was also a member of the Piedmont Environmental Council. And that concludes things. Obviously, the house, these properties have seen a lot of history over the decades, the centuries. It really, I mean, this house is one of the core structures that dates back to the founding of this entire village. So its preservation is essential.
When was the last time do we know someone was living in the house?
There were renters in there several years ago.
10 years ago?
Like 3 years.
3 years ago?
May I make a couple corrections?
Yes, please. The former owner.
I bought it from Jim Kaler in 19